Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was one of those nights where everything feels like it's in slow motion, like the world is holding its breath. Austin, Texas, had a strange calm before the storm. The sun had long set, and the air had that sticky humidity that made it feel like the city was sweating in anticipation of a heavy downpour. I'd spent the day cooped up inside, catching up on some work and just enjoying the quiet. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, just a short trip to visit some friends in Houston, and I was left in the house alone. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't scared or anything. I'm 22, so being alone in the house for a couple of days felt like a mini vacation. The kind of freedom you don't get when your parents are around. I could stay up as late as I wanted, binge watch whatever I felt like, and eat pizza without anyone telling me I shouldn't. So, when I noticed the dark clouds rolling in, I didn't really think much of it. Thunderstorms weren't rare in Texas. Hell, it's almost a regular thing. The weather could switch on you at any moment, and you'd never even see it coming. It was just another storm. I remember that the first rumble of thunder wasn't even that loud. It sounded like someone had dropped something heavy upstairs. I looked out the window for a second, watching the clouds gather. The sky wasn't dark enough yet to get that apocalyptic feeling, but the air definitely felt different. Thick, like the entire atmosphere was about to crack open. The wind began to pick up, howling a little as it brushed the trees outside, making them sway, and a few branches creaked against the windows like they were trying to knock to get in. By that point, I had settled on the couch in the living room, wrapping a blanket around myself and opening up a bag of chips. I figured I'd just wait out the storm, watch a couple of videos, maybe read a few things. It was peaceful, almost eerily so, given the storm that was brewing outside. The storm didn't seem too bad at first. It was just rain. Heavy but steady, and the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the sky in a brief, blinding flash. But then the thunder started to grow louder, the kind that shakes the walls and makes your stomach drop. The sound of it seemed to come from deep within the earth, like a giant's growl, rolling through the house with each passing second. I'll admit, I was a little jumpy. Thunder like that always makes me tense up. I glanced over at the window where the raindrops were now streaking down in sheets, the storm becoming more violent by the second. I couldn't help but wonder why my parents hadn't texted me yet to check in. They'd told me they'd be back by tomorrow afternoon, so I assumed everything was fine. I was still scrolling through my phone, mindlessly flicking through videos, when I heard it. Bang. At first, I thought it was just the wind again. Maybe a tree branch hitting the side of the house or the shutters rattling. I didn't even flinch. I was too absorbed in what I was doing. But then, just as I started to shrug it off, it came again. Bang. This one was louder, closer. Almost like something big had just fallen over, or something heavy had been dropped from the top floor. The noise rattled the walls, and I could feel it vibrate through the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't a normal sound. I could feel my stomach flip, a tight knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I set my phone down, uneasy. The thunder outside didn't let up, but the house felt different. The air in the room had changed. It went from warm and comfortable to suddenly cold, the kind of chill you get when something's not right. I turned my head toward the hallway, looking down toward the basement door. The house wasn't huge, but it was old. One of those two-story homes with creaky floors, dark corners, and narrow hallways. The basement was just off the kitchen, down a flight of stairs that always felt like they belonged in a different time. It was weird that I was hearing sounds coming from the basement. I stood up from the couch, trying to rationalize it. It was probably just the storm. That's what I told myself. The wind could have pushed something over, or maybe it was just the house settling in the pressure change. But there was something about it. Something about the way the sound echoed through the house that felt off, not natural. Then, between the crashes of thunder and the howl of the wind, I heard something I wasn't expecting. Footsteps. At first, it was so soft I thought I had imagined it. You know how sometimes you think you hear things like a creak or a thump, but it turns out to be nothing? That's what I thought this was. But then the footsteps came again. Slow, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that sound like someone is walking with purpose, like they know exactly where they're going. They were coming from the basement, the stairs, the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs creaking slowly, with each step getting louder and closer. The sound crawled up my spine, and for a moment I couldn't move. My entire body froze. I kept my eyes glued to the hallway, unable to tear them away. The seconds felt like hours. Step, step, step. I swear I could hear my own breath, but everything else felt like it was being swallowed up by the storm outside. My chest felt tight, like there was a weight pressing on my lungs. I couldn't tell if the steps were getting louder or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. But they were there. The slow, rhythmic sound of someone, or something, climbing the stairs from the basement. I don't know how long I stood there, not moving, barely breathing. The storm outside had become a distant rumble at that point, like it was no longer the focus of the night. The focus now was on the steps climbing the basement stairs. Whoever it was knew I was home, and they were coming for me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind was a storm of thoughts. Should I hide? Should I call someone? Should I do something? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't just stand there, waiting to find out who was coming for me. The adrenaline hit me all at once, and I wasn't thinking clearly. My hands felt clammy as I stumbled backward toward the kitchen. The knife. I had to get the knife. It was the only thing I could think of. It was stupid, but it was all I could think to do. My legs were shaking so badly that it felt like I was walking through wet concrete as I made my way into the kitchen. I tried to steady my breath, but the noise from the storm outside, mixed with the sound of the footsteps creeping ever closer, made it feel like my heart was going to explode from my chest. I grabbed the first large knife I could find from the block, its cold metal handle sending a shiver up my arm as I held it tightly. My fingers trembled uncontrollably, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I darted back toward the hallway, glancing nervously at the door that led to the basement stairs. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side, but I wasn't about to find out. My best bet was to get somewhere safe, away from whoever was in my house. Without thinking, I ran to my bedroom, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I could feel the cold sweat running down my neck. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing in circles. Should I call the police? Should I hide? Should I just leave and run out of the house? But there was no way I was going outside, not with the storm raging and whoever was in my house still out there. I locked the door behind me as quietly as I could, but it felt like the loudest sound in the world. The lock clicked in place, and I stepped back, holding the knife out in front of me like it would somehow shield me from whatever was coming. The noise from the storm outside seemed to grow more intense as the footsteps continued, getting louder with every step. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. A door slammed open. The sound of something heavy being thrown against the wall, followed by muffled shuffling, like someone was desperately looking for something. Someone was searching the rooms. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the knife steady. I crept over to the bathroom door that connected to my bedroom, locking it behind me as I squeezed into the small space. I didn't know why I chose to hide in there, but it seemed safer than staying out in the open. The bathroom was small, cramped, and had no windows. It felt suffocating, but it was my only option. I turned off the lights, trying to keep everything as quiet as possible, but my breath was coming out in loud, terrified bursts. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made me jump, but I couldn't stop myself. I dialed 911 with shaky fingers, praying to God that I wasn't too late. The phone rang, and I almost thought it wouldn't connect. It felt like time was dragging on forever, like the whole world had frozen. But then the operator finally picked up. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice was calm. It is too calm for what I was feeling. I could hear the faint sound of static in the background, the storm outside seeming to get louder with each second that passed. There's someone in my house, I whispered, my voice so quiet I could barely hear it myself. I don't know who they are, but they're in my house. I don't know what to do. Stay calm, the operator said, her voice gentle but firm. Are you in a safe place right now? I'm in the bathroom, I whispered. I locked the door, but I don't know if they're still here. They're looking for something. I can hear them moving around. Stay quiet, she instructed. We've got officers on the way. Keep the line open and don't make any noise. We're sending help. I nodded. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible, praying that whoever was in the house hadn't heard me talking. The last thing I needed was for them to know where I was hiding. I could hear the rummaging in the other rooms more clearly now. Drawers opening and closing, things being knocked over, the sound of furniture scraping against the floor. Whoever was in my house, they weren't being careful anymore. They were desperate, searching through every corner of the house. I couldn't figure out if they were looking for something specific or just trying to take whatever they could. It didn't matter, though. They were still there. My hands were cold. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I clutched the phone in one hand and the knife in the other. I pressed my back against the wall, hoping the intruder wouldn't hear my every move. The minutes seemed to stretch on, unbearable, filled only by the sound of the storm outside and the chaos unfolding in the house. Then, the worst sound yet. The back door slammed open. The force of it was so loud that it rattled the walls of the house, and I swear I could hear the wind howling through the gap, mingling with the deafening crash of thunder. I heard voices, distant shouts, but they were muffled and drowned out by the storm. I don't know how long it took for the sirens to finally reach my street, but when I heard them, something inside me broke. I hadn't even realized how tightly I had been holding my breath until I let it out in a slow, trembling exhale. The footsteps that had been creeping through the house stopped, as if the intruder had heard the sirens too. Then I heard them running, rushing toward the back door, and I knew in that instant the intruder was trying to escape. I stayed as still as I could, barely daring to breathe, as I waited for the sound of police cars pulling up outside. My mind kept racing, wondering if I'd imagined everything, or if whoever had been in the house was still lingering, hidden in some corner, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then it happened. The police cars screeched into the driveway, their lights flashing through the bathroom window. The storm had already made the house dark, but the lights from the squad cars were bright enough to momentarily blind me. The sirens cut through the night, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. But even with the sound of the police outside, I couldn't bring myself to leave the bathroom. I waited, listening to the muffled voices of the officers outside as they began to search the house. I heard the heavy steps of boots on the floorboards, the sound of doors being thrown open. The minutes dragged on like hours. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, still trying to remain as silent as possible, afraid that the intruder, or whoever else might be lurking in the shadows, could somehow hear me. My breath came in shallow, quiet gasps as I listened to the officers' movements outside the bathroom door. I heard them calling out to each other, their voices muffled by the walls, but still sharp and clear enough to make me feel a flicker of hope. I could hear the footsteps moving upstairs, moving through the rooms, then down the stairs. The house felt alive with their presence, as if they were making sure everything was clear, but all I could think of was what might happen if the intruder was still somewhere in the house, waiting. Eventually, I heard someone outside my bedroom door, their footsteps stopping just outside. The silence stretched on, and for a moment I thought maybe they had left, or maybe I'd somehow imagined it all. But then a voice broke the silence, and I recognized it immediately. Alex? It was a man's voice, deep, authoritative. "This is the police. Are you okay?" I didn't know if I could speak. My throat was tight, and I was afraid that if I made any noise, the intruder would hear me or come back, but I had to answer. "Yes," I croaked, barely able to get the words out. "I'm in the bathroom. I'm safe." The door to the bathroom creaked open slowly, and there stood one of the officers, his face partially obscured by the flashlight he was holding. The beam of light swept over the room, landing briefly on my shaking hands before it turned toward the rest of the bathroom. "All right," the officer said softly. "You're safe now." I nodded, too scared to speak. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was tempered by an even darker thought. Who had been in my house? The officers gently guided me out of the bathroom and into the hallway, where the flashing lights of their cars illuminated the entire house, casting long, stark shadows against the walls. I could see the damage now. The furniture was knocked over in some of the rooms, as if whoever had been in the house had been looking for something, anything they could take. The drawers were pulled open, some of them hanging half off their hinges. Every room I passed felt like it had been turned upside down. "We found signs of forced entry," one of the officers told me, his voice serious. "A basement window was pried open. Looks like they came in that way." They moved quickly through the house, checking every room. I could hear them talking to each other, and I noticed that they didn't seem as shocked as I felt. They'd probably seen things like this before, but what unnerved me was the way they moved. They were being thorough, too thorough almost. "What exactly did you hear?" another officer asked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. I felt myself growing tense again. I took a breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I heard something fall in the basement. Then, footsteps. I hid in the bathroom. The officer nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. "We'll need to take your statement later, but for now, you're safe." I followed the officer to the front door, my legs still weak, my head spinning. I barely registered the sound of the rain as it hit the ground outside, or the flashing red and blue lights that danced across the driveway. My entire world had shrunk to this moment, the aftermath of whatever had just happened in my house. As I stepped outside into the damp night air, I noticed another officer looking at the basement window. It had been pried open, the edges of the frame bent and jagged. I could see where someone had tried to force their way in. How had I not heard anything? "We've got a couple of questions for you later," the officer continued, pulling me from my thoughts. "But for now, we'll get a squad car to take you to a safe place. You're going to be all right." I couldn't even bring myself to respond. I was too exhausted, my mind too scattered, but the relief I felt, however brief, was palpable. I didn't have to be alone in that house anymore. The police were here. I was safe. The intruder was never caught. The police said they had picked up a few clues, but nothing concrete. The whole thing felt like a twisted nightmare. And as for me, I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the basement stairs. The storm may have passed, but it's the sound of those footsteps that still echoes in my mind. It was one of those quiet weekends I'd been hoping for. Life had been moving fast, work had been overwhelming, and I was desperate for some time away from everything. When my friend Tyler called and asked me to house sit for him while he visited some relatives out of town, I didn't hesitate to say yes. It wasn't like I had much going on anyway. Tyler lived in a small house just outside of town, in one of those quiet neighborhoods where the roads feel like they end and you're left with nothing but fields and an occasional distant neighbor. The house itself was a bit old but cozy in that lived in, this place has a story to tell way. Tyler always talked about how much he liked the solitude out there, away from the city noise. And I can see why. The house sat on a large lot with a big backyard that led out to thick brush, a few trees scattered around, and open fields stretching out in all directions. It almost felt like the house was in its own little world, separated from the chaos of everything else. It wasn't even in a neighborhood, really. It was a lone house at the edge of the town. That evening, the storm rolled in. I didn't think much of it at first. The sky darkened quickly as thick clouds piled up above, and the first gusts of wind started to hit. The kind of wind that makes the trees sway, and you can feel it deep in your bones. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when the first crack of thunder hit. It wasn't just any thunder, it was the kind that shakes the windows, the kind that seems to rattle the whole house. My body instinctively tensed, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. The rain was already coming down in sheets, heavy and relentless. The whole world outside seemed to blur. The storm had its own kind of rhythm, almost hypnotic, with the wind howling and the rain slamming against the glass in a constant drumming sound. For a moment, I watched the flashes of lightning dance across the sky, illuminating the darkened yard and the endless expanse of fields beyond it. Everything felt eerie, as if the storm was shutting out the rest of the world. I sat back down, shaking off the sense of unease that seemed to settle in the pit of my stomach. It was just the storm, I told myself. It was nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, this old, isolated place, was somehow watching me. Maybe it was the way the storm made the world outside look so distant and unreachable. It made me feel small. It made me feel like I was in the eye of something much bigger than myself. The sound of the rain intensifying against the windows almost drowned out the hum of the old house, but I could still hear the creaks in the floorboards beneath me, the way the house groaned and shifted as the storm battered it from all sides. It was nothing new. Houses make noises, especially old ones. Still, it didn't sit well with me. Every creak seemed to have a life of its own, and I couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that something was moving in the walls, something that didn't belong. Just as I tried to push those thoughts aside and focus on the storm, the lights flickered. It wasn't just a flicker. It was more like the lights were struggling, fighting against the storm's power. For a moment, I thought the whole house was going to lose power. The lights dimmed, then brightened again, flickered once more, and then nothing. The entire room went dark. I froze. The house was completely silent, except for the furious pounding of the rain and the occasional crack of thunder that shook the very foundation of the place. It was as if the storm had somehow swallowed up everything. I reached for my phone, using the dim light from the screen to get my bearings. I glanced around the room, my eyes adjusting to the near darkness. I figured I should check the breaker box, especially since Tyler had mentioned that the power had gone out a few times before during storms like this. It wasn't unusual, not for a house this old. I walked down the narrow hallway toward the laundry room, where the breaker box was. The floor creaked under my feet with every step, and I tried my best not to make too much noise. But with the storm raging outside, the sound of my own footfalls felt strangely loud. I reached for the door to the laundry room and was about to open it when I heard something. A sharp knock. It was loud, deliberate. It came from the back door. I froze. I couldn't make sense of it. The storm was wild, and there was no reason anyone would be out in this weather. The wind outside howled like some kind of animal, the rain smashing against the windows so hard I thought it might break through. It didn't make sense. Who would be knocking on the door in the middle of a storm like this? I cautiously made my way to the back door, trying to be as quiet as possible. The hallway seemed unnaturally long in the dark, and I had to stop myself from walking too fast. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had locked the door earlier when I came in, I was sure of it. Still, I couldn't help but feel a sudden wave of dread wash over me. I crept up to the window next to the back door and cautiously peeked through the curtain. The rain was coming down so hard it was difficult to see anything beyond a few feet, but I could make out the shadows of trees in the distance, swaying violently in the wind. There was nothing near the door. No one. I stood there for a few moments, trying to steady my breathing. Was I imagining things? Had the wind just caused something to knock against the door? The storm was fierce, after all. But then I heard the knock again. It was just as sharp, just as urgent as before. My chest tightened and I felt a chill run down my spine. I had been imagining things, right? No one would be out there in this kind of weather. No one could have gotten close to the house without me noticing. I pulled away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Maybe it was just a branch blown by the wind, slapping against the door. That had to be it. I didn't want to open the door, not with the storm howling outside, but I couldn't just ignore it either. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The knock had been too real. Reluctantly, I stepped back from the door, locked it again for good measure, and tried to shake off the unease settling in my stomach, but I couldn't relax. Not fully. The storm outside was terrifying enough on its own, but it was the knock that wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to sit back down on the bedroom's couch, turning the lights back on with my phone's flashlight. The storm was still raging, but I tried to focus on it. The howling wind, the crack of thunder, the torrential rain. It was all part of the storm. But as I sat there, a flash of light streaked across the room. It wasn't the lightning. No, this light was much closer, much more direct. It moved across the living room like a bright beam sweeping through the room. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, suddenly feeling dizzy with fear. The beam of light was steady, too steady, and it didn't belong. It wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from inside the house. The beam moved, cutting across the couch, then sweeping over the walls and fading into the dark hallway beyond. Whoever was inside the house wasn't just standing still. They were moving, and they had a flashlight. I stood there frozen, the realization hitting me like a punch in the stomach. Someone was in the house. I couldn't move. The beam of light vanished into the dark hallway, and for a few seconds, I was frozen in place, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced. Was it possible that someone had snuck in when the power went out? I didn't hear any doors open, and I certainly hadn't heard any footsteps. How could anyone have gotten in without me noticing? I shook my head, trying to shake off the panic starting to rise. I couldn't afford to be this scared. I had to stay calm. I had to think clearly. I crept toward the hallway, my heart thudding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried to make as little noise as possible, but the old floorboards creaked under my weight with every step. I winced, hoping I wasn't alerting whoever was in the house to my movements. The beam of light reappeared, briefly illuminating the narrow hallway in front of me, and then it vanished again. I froze. Someone was walking around. The light was moving as if they were searching for something. But what? I backed away slowly, inching toward the bedroom. I tried not to let my feet make too much noise, but the floorboards seemed determined to betray me. Each creak felt like a shout in the otherwise silent house. I reached the door to the bedroom, and for a moment I hesitated. Should I hide in here? What if the intruder saw me? But then the thought of being out in the open, unprotected, was even worse. I turned the handle quietly and slipped inside. The room was dark, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the walls in sharp, jagged light. The storm outside had escalated, the wind gusting against the house with such force that it rattled the windows. My breath came out in shaky, quick bursts, and I tried to control the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I locked the bedroom door behind me and backed away from it, pressing myself against the wall. I tried to steady my breathing, but the anxiety was suffocating. Every time the storm's roar would die down, the silence felt even more oppressive. There was no way I could leave through the front door without running into whoever was in the house. And the back door, well, I had no idea if that was even safe anymore. Then came the sound that sent my heart racing again. A thud, a heavy, deliberate thud from the hallway. It was slow, but unmistakable. Someone was walking closer, and they were getting closer to the bedroom. I had to act fast. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and, with trembling fingers, typed in 911. My hands shook so violently that I could barely make the numbers come out right. The screen was too dim and my thumb kept slipping, making everything take longer than it should have. I finally managed to send a message with my address and a quick note. Someone's in the house. I hit send, praying it would get through. I barely registered the sound of my phone vibrating, a text coming in from the dispatcher confirming they received the message. But my attention snapped back to the door. The doorknob rattled. I froze and my breath caught in my throat. The sound of the doorknob turning slowly, methodically, was the last thing I expected. They twisted the knob again, and then the softest of knocks came, almost mocking me. I backed away further into the room, my eyes frantically scanning for anything I could use as a weapon. A lamp, a chair, nothing. The room was sparse, and the only thing I could think of doing was to remain as quiet as possible, to pray that the intruder would leave. But the longer the silence stretched, the more impossible it felt to stay calm. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled again, harder this time. There was no mistaking it. The person on the other side was trying to get in. The knob jiggled violently now, followed by a heavy thud like something or someone slamming into the door with force. I sucked in a breath, my chest tightening painfully as panic spread through me. I pressed myself against the wall harder, trying to make myself as small as possible. The doorknob rattled again, and I thought I might lose control. It sounded like someone was now shoulder-checking the door, trying to force it open. My legs were shaking, my hands cold and slick with sweat. I barely dared to move. I couldn't make a sound. The thuds became more frequent, each one punctuated by a sound that seemed to crackle through the house, magnified by the storm's roar. And then, suddenly, complete silence. For a few seconds, I wondered if the person had given up, but the silence felt wrong. It was too still, too heavy. I couldn't risk waiting any longer. I pulled my phone out again and called 911, my voice barely a whisper. The line clicked, and a voice on the other end responded. I almost couldn't believe it. Someone was on the way. I could hear the sirens in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. But it still felt like an eternity until they would actually arrive. I clung to the hope that they would get there in time, that I wouldn't have to face whatever this was alone. And then a single sharp knock echoed from the front door, followed by another. Police. There was a strange kind of stillness in the house now, like everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it. The sound of a door being kicked open. I flinched, then froze as the sounds of shouting followed. Voices. Men's voices. yelling orders and commands. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the police had arrived. The footsteps I heard earlier were running now, scrambling away. There was a loud crash, something heavy hitting the ground, and the sound of shuffling footsteps fading down the hall, retreating into the dark. The police burst into the bedroom moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their faces etched with concern. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, rushing to my side. I nodded, barely able to speak. My throat was dry, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't even know where to begin. But I must have looked a mess, because the officer gently guided me to sit down on the bed, his hands firm but reassuring. "We've got him," another officer called out from the hallway. His voice was distant, but the relief in it was unmistakable. I barely processed what was happening. My mind was still trying to catch up. My body felt like it was in a daze, and I could hear the sounds of the officers searching the house. Their flashlights moved around the walls, casting long shadows as they cleared each room. The storm outside seemed to quiet, like nature itself was taking a pause to listen. My own heartbeat was the loudest thing I could hear. Moments later, they came back into the room. "We've got him," the first officer repeated, this time more firmly. "He's in custody. He didn't get far." I wasn't sure if I felt relief or still dominating terror. The man who had been in the house was caught, but the memories were still fresh. He had been in his mid-30s, dressed in dark, muddy clothes. His hands were shaking as they handcuffed him, and his eyes, those eyes, I couldn't forget them. He looked like a man who was hungry for something, desperate in a way that chilled me to the bone. They found a knife in his pocket, a thick, serrated blade that sent a new wave of cold dread through me. But there was still so much they didn't understand. As the officers escorted him outside, I caught a glimpse of his face one last time. There was no expression. Nothing. Just that blank stare. When everything settled and the police had finished their investigation, I was left standing in the living room, the storm still raging outside. The rain was coming down harder than before, but I didn't care anymore. The house had been invaded. It had been watched by someone who had no business being there. Someone who knew this place, and knew it too well. I was left with only one thought. I couldn't be alone here anymore. I called Tyler, my voice shaking as I told him everything that had happened. He was surprised, but he thanked me for staying safe. He said he'd be back tomorrow. I didn't feel safe, though. Not anymore. The storm had passed by the time I left the house, but the fear remained with me, lingering long after the rain had stopped.